The inspiration behind our product came from understanding how big of a problem livestock methane emissions were.
I'm Yvan Bourgnon, I'm a sailor. I spent half time of my life on the sea. We have a factory who can convert this plastic to energy. And so after, at the end, we can minimize the footprint carbon of the boat.
It's 7 o'clock and this is a Sky News Tonight question and answer programme on the war in Ukraine, featuring once again Professor Michael Clarke. Also ahead, a special report from besieged Severo Donetsk in the Donbass. Sky News reports from a city on the front line where thousands of civilians are still trapped with no real way out.
Well, this is going on all the time. Constant barrage. It's unbelievable that there are so many people who are still living and having to put up with this.
Ukraine's Klitschko brothers arrive in Davos bearing a warning and calling for the assembled world leaders to help protect Ukraine. And Russia is accused of weaponizing Ukraine's food supplies, with global consequences as its blockade of Odessa continues. A very good evening. Well, it's been 3 months since Russia marched troops across the border into Ukraine, and millions of people have since been displaced. Tens of thousands of troops and civilians have been killed, and still the conflict continues. Well, coming up in just a few minutes, Professor Michael Clarke will be here answering the questions that you've been sending to us throughout the day. And just before that, we'll have a special report from Alex Crawford from the front line in Severo, Donetsk. But first, let's bring you today's other main stories. And the UK's energy price cap is expected to rise in October to around £2,800. The head of the energy regulator made the announcement, attributing the need for a rise to the global gas market and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The current price cap of £1,971 a year applies until the 31st of September, and that's already £693 higher than the previous cap set 6 months earlier. Downing Street has denied reports that the Prime Minister urged the civil servant Sue Gray to drop her plans to publish her report into social events in Number 10 during lockdowns. The report is expected to be released this week, and Boris Johnson has come under renewed pressure after images emerged of him raising a glass in Downing Street at a gathering in November 2020. Sky News understands at least one person was fined over that event, but not the Prime Minister. There are now 71 confirmed cases of monkeypox in the UK after another 14 were recorded in England. There's only one known infection in Scotland at the moment, and there haven't been any reported for Wales or Northern Ireland. Health officials say they're keeping an eye on the situation with extensive surveillance. Well, to Ukraine then, and despite fierce resistance, Russia is slowly making some progress in its campaign in the east and appears to be on the brink of surrounding a city that it's feared could become the next Mariupol. One of the last big cities under Ukrainian control in Luhansk is Severodonetsk, but Russian forces are encircling it from the north and the south. The main road into Severodonetsk is under heavy bombardment and is now considered to be too unsafe. Well, our special correspondent, Alex Crawford, cameraman Jake Britton, and producer Chris Cunningham spent 24 hours on the ground in Severodonetsk and sent this report on a city and its people living in the face of the Russian advance.
The sound of Severodonetsk being pounded and broken by bombs never stops. Ukrainian troops, vastly outnumbered here, can see the Russians blasting their way in. And underneath all these explosions, there are civilians still trying to survive. One of the main bridges linking the city to the rest of the Donbass has been bombed. It's now impassable. So the only way people can now leave and aid can get in is on this last usable bridge, which has been hit several times already. This is the city's remaining lifeline, and the Ukrainians are only just holding on to it. Inside, there is a humanitarian disaster rapidly unfolding, with thousands of people still here. This is a city which Russia would have banked on being pro-Kremlin, with strong links and often with relatives living there. They are very reluctant evacuees, but they are fleeing in the face of this terrible onslaught.
It's hell. You know, it's hell, first, everyday shelling. Second, a lot of death. Third, humanitarian problems.
The Seoul Working Hospital is now surrounded by Russian troops, so the only chance for the injured is to be evacuated, and this is one of the very few evacuation trips.
Now it seems like the front is all around the city. It's practically surrounded. There are tanks. There are we can see trucks from the army being deployed around the city. So it seems very clear that, to me, it's about to fall.
Are you glad to be going?
Yes and no. I don't know.
Feeling sad about leaving as well? But time is running out if they're to leave. And these volunteers hope to be back later to help more flee. A handful are delivering water, strapping bottles on the back of their bikes to take to those trapped in their homes.
Моя страна гибнет. Очень тяжело. Жалко. Плохо, тяжело. Переживаю.
He was a musician once. Now his world is filled with the sounds of war. A small moment to collect himself.
Ничего.
But we will win, he tells us.
Все будет хорошо.
Everything will be okay.
Сын, спасибо.
Thank you, he says, and kisses my hand. There's work to do. Valeri's another. It's far away, he reassures us about the bombing. The strength of these people continues to astonish. He doesn't even flinch. We're used to it, he says. It's been 3 months. Valeri and his wife Nila won't leave. They've notched up 135 years between them, and they're now enduring bombs which are landing every few minutes. It is unrelenting and goes on and on as he weaves his way back through his community and takes us to his home, where he and his neighbours have been sheltering and where he's been ferrying food and water to, where there seems to be still a fair amount of people living. His neighbours tell us how hard it is to get even water. Yelena's saying she has to carry 2 or 3 bottles by hand. Everyone begins to panic at what sounds like cluster bombs landing far too close by. We head for the doorway to shelter. Open the basement, Valeri shouts. Come, come, he says. I'm used to it. Everyone piles inside, waiting for yet more incoming bombs. Every day is like this, Yelena tells us. It was quiet for just 10 minutes. Every day it's back and forth like this, flying over our heads. Seconds later, Valeri is punched by a neighbour. He's angry at Valeri for bringing foreign journalists here. Many blame us for prompting the bombings. Was he pushed?
This war has set pensioner against pensioner and forced neighbours to turn on each other.
Please tell the world what's happening in Donbass, she says.
What's she saying? What's she saying?
And show, please, how it is.
Yeah, we will.
I'm trying not to cry, she says. I'm trying to keep myself calm, but you need to tell them what the situation is. Well, this is going on all the time. Constant barrage. It's unbelievable that there are so many people who are still living and having to put up with this. They're right in the middle of it. At the aid hub, more injured have been brought in, and one woman has got a very nasty head wound.
There's no gunshot wound, it's just shrapnel. The worst injuries to her head, but obviously she just needs to get evacuated for that.
It turns out Sky News colleague Nick Davenport is the most qualified medic here, probably in the whole of the city. There's a police-trained first aider too, who asks not to be identified. There are 2 badly wounded here, but most certainly not the only ones in dire need of medical help in the city. Emma is back with her evac team, but her vehicle has broken down, so she's urgently trying to find replacements.
We only have 2 passenger vehicles, so...
Somehow the aid hub manager finds a way out for them. This is going to be a difficult and dangerous journey for them, but at least they have hope. There's very little of that going around this city right now as the Russian troops close in. Alex Crawford, Sky News, in Severo, Donetsk, in eastern Ukraine.
Well, now, Professor Michael Clarke is here with me, and we start with some questions on that city from which Alex Crawford was reporting. Welcome once again to you, Michael. And let's kick straight off then with Paul's question. Paul asks, is it possible for Ukrainian forces to hold back the Russian advance in Severo Donetsk? What do we understand then about the balance of forces?
Very difficult. The Russians have now effectively surrounded Severo Donetsk. Not quite. Their northern and southern pincers to the west of the city are probably 10 or 12 miles apart, but I would expect them to actually close those pincers, close that encirclement, let's say in the next 24, 48 hours. The Russians are putting everything into this particular part of the front. They've paused elsewhere, or they're not making very much progress elsewhere, but they're putting everything into Severo Donetsk, so they will surround the city pretty soon. That's not the same as taking it, because we've got to decide on what the Ukrainian forces inside Severo Donetsk might do.
Well, that's the next question following on from that. James asks, if you were in charge of Ukrainian forces, in Severo Donetsk, would you withdraw?
Yeah, I'm very glad that I'm not, I have to say. It's the hardest call for any commander. Essentially, it depends on really a simple calculation in a way. If you're going to allow yourself to be surrounded and ride out some sort of siege, you can only really do that if you think there's a realistic chance that at some point quite soon your forces will be able to break through and break the siege. So if the commander feels that Ukrainian forces will be capable of mounting some sort of counterattack and fight their way back through to them to keep Severodonetsk in Ukrainian hands, then it might be worth it. If you don't think the siege could be lifted, then you're only withstanding a siege for some symbolic or maybe humanitarian reason to protect civilians or something like that. But in strict military terms, if you don't think you're going to be relieved, then it's probably best to withdraw and let the city go.
And we've talked then, you talked there about the concentration of Russian forces in this area. Well, Adrian asked, strategically, what is more important for Ukraine, to defend the Donbass or Odessa? So where does Ukraine concentrate its defences? Does it have enough to split them?
Yeah, if you had to choose, you'd choose to keep Odessa open. The Donbass is a very important area of Ukraine, but it's the area of Ukraine which has suffered civil war already, and there's an awful lot of devastation there. And in a way, the rest of Ukraine has adjusted to the problem of the Donbass since 2014. But Odessa is the window on the sea, the window on the outside world. And while Odessa is open, at the moment, of course, it's blockaded, but if Odessa is open, then Ukraine has a window on the sea. Otherwise, it's landlocked. So strategically, I would say Odessa matters more than... And that whole coastline, Odessa, Mariupol, matters more. Sorry, I say Mariupol, Mykolaiv, Odessa Mykolaiv matters more than the Donbass itself.
And in terms of the distribution of Ukrainian forces, of course, we still can't forget Kiev, and there are reports of Belarusian troop movements to the north.
There are, but, I mean, what the Belarusians have done is they've got their special forces exercising up and down the border. I don't think they're going to cross the border for all sorts of reasons that we've spoken about. And the Ukrainians have only got a screening force. They've essentially got their territorial defence force and some reserves screening it. So at the moment, the Ukrainians are not actually allowing the Belarusians to draw too much of their forces away, and they can't afford to. But I think they must have a backup plan to actually move forces quickly. And remember, they've still got a railway system with a good 23,000 kilometres of track. So they can move forces quite quickly if they have to in Ukraine. So at the moment, I think they're only screening this Belarusian gesture. And at the moment, I think it is only a gesture.
Well, let's follow up with another question about Odessa and, of course, the fact that it's on the sea. And Mark asked this, might Russia try to take Odessa with an amphibious landing? Because, of course, it controls the sea outside Odessa.
Very, very difficult. An amphibious landing alone. An amphibious element to a ground offensive makes perfect sense, but amphibious landings alone are extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. Not many countries can do it, and they're always risky. I mean, the two great examples in British military history one was Gallipoli in 1915, an amphibious landing on the Bosphorus. The troops got onto the beach, Turkish forces got onto the high ground above them, and they were stuck on the beach for 10 months. 10 months before they were withdrawn, the whole thing was miserable, it was a failure. The other great one, of course, was D-Day. And the interesting thing about D-Day, it was a huge operation, the biggest invasion, the biggest amphibious invasion in history, bar none. Extremely complex, every last detail was thought about, and yet it still came down to one brutal fact, one brutal equation, is that could the Allies, on the 6th of June, 1944, could they get 150,000 men onto the beaches and into their sort of fingertip hold on the peninsula? And if they were still there and mainly alive 24 hours later, then the invasion had succeeded, because there was so much coming in behind them. But it was a huge risk. And Eisenhower, who was the architect of it, of course, he was the supreme commander. He wrote, ahead of the invasion, he wrote his failure note. He wrote the note of what he was going to say if it failed, saying, you know, it was my decision, nobody else was responsible, it was mine alone. And he had that, it was a handwritten note, and he put it in his battle dress pocket. And he kept it with him for several days until he was sure that an invasion had succeeded. Because we know what happened, we take it for granted. It couldn't have failed. Absolutely, it could have failed. They are hugely risky things to try, amphibious operations.
And Russia has nothing approaching those kind of forces.
Nothing like. I mean, they can mount amphibious landings, but you know, if I were a Russian commander, I would certainly not want to try to take Odessa, given that the opposition know you're coming. If you take them by surprise, that's different. But if the opposition are expecting you, the fact is that your troops coming into, whether it's the port or the beach that you're trying to assault, I mean, they're sitting ducks for 2 miles out until they arrive. And even when they arrive, they're very vulnerable until they establish some sort of toehold, and then the reinforcements can arrive, and that usually takes many, many hours.
OK, well, let's talk now about the economic war. We all know about the economic sanctions being visited upon Russia, but now the extreme sanctions that are being returned by Russia through the form of food exports. Kev asked this. To help get seaborne exports flowing to and from Odessa, could NATO provide Ukraine with anti-ship missiles to create a protected sea corridor? Presumably it already has, because there was the sinking of that great battle cruiser.
Yes, I mean, the Moskva, that went down actually with Ukraine's own missiles, the Neptune, which they seemed to be the first time they'd used them, so they hit a bullseye, I think, first time. But they're being supplied with Harpoon NATO weapons, which is an American-based weapon, very, very capable, with a range of about 80 miles, 140, 150 kilometres, something like that. And they will make a difference to the Ukrainians as we're keeping Russian ships further out for safety. But that's a different thing to creating a protected sea corridor, because a protected sea corridor, when I can see what the thought is behind the question, is it possible to create some sort of humanitarian sea corridor so that tankers and grain ships in particular can get in and out of Odessa and get all this food, which is backed up in Ukraine, out to world markets, which are suffering grievously for lack of Ukrainian grain.
Well, Anne asked more or less the same question. If the Black Sea around Odessa is in international waters, why can't it be patrolled by NATO as a deterrent? And this talk today of the UK leading a coalition of the willing to try to protect those sea routes.
Yeah, well, this was a conversation between the Lithuanian foreign minister and our own foreign minister, Liz Truss. It's not been taken up elsewhere, and it's all very, very speculative, because if there were an international force of any sort, but particularly one involving NATO ships, then they'd be challenging the Russians. They'd be daring the Russians to stop them, and it would be a pretty dangerous thing to have to do. There's been some talk, well, why doesn't Egypt do it? Egypt's got grain ships, and they've got some warships, so why don't they do it? Remember, too, that the Bosphorus, the route into the Black Sea, is closed at the moment because Turkey controls that, and they won't allow any warships through to the Black Sea. They'll let warships come out, but it's their privilege under international law to stop more warships going in. So the Turkish government would have to agree to it. Somebody would have to be prepared to take on daring the Russians. It's hard to imagine it happening without the Russians agreeing. And the Russians will only agree, they have hinted, if sanctions in some way are lessened. And so they wouldn't agree for humanitarian reasons. They'll only agree if they get something pretty big out of it to actually lessen the pressure on them. So it's a devil's bargain, to be honest.
Questions now, several about how the war might end, or how a stalemate might lead to an end to the fighting, whatever. We've got this question here. If Ukraine gave the Donbass region to Russia, could the UN police a buffer zone? Well, of course, Russia's part of the United Nations, but I see what the questioner means.
In principle, it could, yeah. I mean, there was, before the war broke out, from 2014, when the Russians last invaded, there was an OSCE monitoring mission there. The OSCE is the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, so it's like a region, it's like a mini UN in Europe, composed of 57 nations, 57 European nations. And the OSCE had quite a big monitoring mission in the Donbass to try to report on violations of the ceasefire that were established under the Minsk Agreement and Minsk II and so on. But, of course, because it involved all the nations of the OSCE, including Russia, some of the monitors were Russians. And some of the monitors were Belarusians, and some of the monitors were German and Italian and Ukrainian. And so the nearer we got to the invasion in February, the more the Russian monitors were seeing something completely different to what the German monitors were
Imagine
seeing.
that.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, the monitoring mission got less and less credible, but it did a good job with some very brave people, to be honest, from 2014 right through to 2021. So, yes, it is possible to have a monitoring mission, but all of these monitoring missions, all they can do, when we say, can they police a buffer zone? Well, you can observe in a buffer zone, but if you're going to police a buffer zone, you have to have troops who are prepared to fight back or fire back if they're fired on. And that's a very different issue altogether.
OK, another question, this one from Ronnie, asking if Russia takes the Donbass. I mean, this effectively is about, what will Russia want? What does Russia want? What its war aims are after altering the original battle plan of taking the entirety of Ukraine? If Russia takes the Donbass, will they keep going or will the war end?
Well, I think the short answer is this phase of the war might end because President Putin's in a real mess. It's getting worse. And if he could walk away with something now, then he might go for some sort of ceasefire. He might make some offer, which would be hard for some of the European countries to refuse. But it wouldn't put an end to the war because, as far as we understand, and looking at everything Putin has said in the last 10 years, and particularly in the last 8 or 10 months, this man still wants to destroy Ukraine as an independent state. He doesn't believe Ukraine has a right to exist. It should be a part of Russia. It should be the little Russia that it always used to be. And so a Donbass victory might be enough of an incentive for him to end this particular phase. But nobody, absolutely nobody in the analysis business believes that he would not then try to engineer a future crisis and do the same thing again when he's learned some of the lessons of this particular disaster. So it wouldn't end the conflict. It would end this phase of the conflict, perhaps.
And it's also about the pressure or not put upon Ukraine. We know the Ukrainians vastly don't want to cede any territory and they want back what they lost in 2014 as well. But none other than Henry Kissinger today at the Davos summit was suggesting some ceding of territory to bring this to an end as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that's Henry. He's a great 19th century strategist, which I'm not being rude about him. He's a wonderful character with a very, very sharp mind. But he thinks in Bismarckian terms that you have to do deals, and deals are, if territory seems to matter to people, then it matters, even though in the modern world you think, well, in a globalised world, why should it? But if it seems to, then it does. And again, he's being pragmatic and saying that Russia is a country that we're going to live with for the foreseeable future. We've got Russia is part of Europe and Asia. You can't wish it away just because Putin is in control at the moment. And so we've got to think about bringing this conflict to an end in order to get on to better terms and move forward. I understand that, but my view, and I would disagree with Kissinger here. Gosh, me disagreeing with Kissinger, but I would disagree with him, and I have in the past, is that this is so important that the world has changed, the post-war world has changed because of this invasion, and that the whole of the Western world, Western liberal democracy, is under threat by this invasion. So our duty is not to end the war. Our duty, if we can, is to help Ukraine win it in terms that strengthen Western democracy and diminish the power of unprovoked aggression in the modern world. OK, well, I'm going to follow through on that. I've got another question, but Sandmax asks the broad question then, more or less, if not that, then what? When will this war end? And more to the point, how then? If it's not about some slices of land in exchange for a ceasefire, if it is as existential as you describe, then we're back to what do we do about Putin, aren't we? Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two glib answers. They're not wrong, but they're just glib. I mean, one is, wars end when both sides or all sides think that they can't gain any more politically by fighting. They keep on fighting when they think it's doing them some good politically. Once, if one side may decide that it's not doing them any more good, the other side, if they do think it's doing them some good, is in a very dominant position. But wars end when fighting does not seem to be achieving any of the political things that they want. And when the sides have got to that point, then they tend to get interested in negotiations and they try then to get the best out of the situation that they've put themselves in. And neither side at the moment, Ukraine or Russia, is in that situation presently. They both think it is worth continuing to fight for their different reasons. How might it end? It ends in a way, this is the existential issue, it ends for us when Putin goes. my view is we can't live with Putin's Russia in a future stable Europe. I mean, he has destabilised Europe and will continue to destabilise it. So for me, this goes on, not necessarily the fighting, but the struggle with Russia, the conflict with Russia, the fact that we're not going to play nice games with him anymore. This goes on for as long as he is there.
OK, we've got some more questions about Putin and his future coming up in the next half of this programme. But on the issue then, the fighting continues. A lot of our viewers have asked this question and have asked it in the past and continue to ask it and continue to wonder, why isn't Ukraine attacking targets in Russia or even bombing Moscow, given that they're being attacked in their territory? Why don't they do a bit of tit for tat?
Two quick reasons. One is bombing Moscow wouldn't make any difference militarily. It would just be an outrageous thing in the Russian eyes to do. And secondly, more importantly, in a way, it would destroy Ukraine's moral superiority. The point about Ukraine is that everyone in the West, pretty well, in the West, not in the rest of the world, is on Ukraine's side because they are victims of an unprovoked attack. They are the victims of clear aggression. And as long as they stick to trying to throw the Russians out of their country, nobody can disagree with that as an objective. If they started to attack Russia, even though in military war terms there might be some rationale, not Moscow, but say Belgorod, just over the border, which is a supply hub. If they started to bomb Belgorod in any significant way, they would, although militarily that would make some sort of sense, it would destroy the moral superiority which at present Ukraine is able to trade on.
Well, our next question is from someone who clearly has some deep military knowledge. It's from someone called Riley, who asks this. There are reports of Russia equipping BTGs with a T-62 tank. Considering the age of these tanks, will they have a big impact on the battles in Donbass? So tell us about T-62s and BTGs.
Yeah, the T-62 goes back to about 1961. It's an old, very old tank. There's lots of them in the world. I mean, the Russians sold them to all sorts of countries around the world, so you can see them in lots of places in the world. The Russians have got about 5,000 tanks in storage, of which about, I think, 2,500 are probably meant to be T-62s. And the Russians were supposed to have got rid of all of their tank stocks a while ago. Then it turned out that they hadn't, or the T-62 stocks. It turned out they hadn't. They'd sent a lot of them to Syria, where you can still see them in Assad's forces. If the T-62s are turning up in the BTGs, which are the battalion tactical groups, which is the fighting unit, it's like
how many men?
It's about 700. It's a bit like a battle group in Western terms. So it's like a battalion. Some of them are 1,000, some of them down to 500. It depends what their job is, really. But if some of them are turning up in these armoured BTGs, then I wouldn't give much for the crews of them because they're not very good at taking fire. They're quite vulnerable, and they are old. But the Russians may well be. They're certainly cutting into their stocks, and they are having to bring more tanks out. What we've seen is most of the tanks are the ubiquitous T-72s, and that's what the Ukrainians have. There's a few T-80s in the battle, and I've seen a couple of T-90s, which are very modern tanks. We haven't seen any of their space-age tank is called the Armata, the T-14, which looks like a piece of space-age kit. We haven't seen any of those yet, and I don't think we will. So, effectively, this is a battle that will be won and lost with the T-72. If the Russians are bringing the T-62s into the equation, then I think the Ukrainian anti-tank missiles will do even better.
Well, that's about the hardware. What about the personnel? Last question for this section on that. Again, oft asked and oft wondered about how significantly would the situation change if Putin ordered full mobilisation of his forces? And that would turn it into Russia accepting it's a war.
Yeah, absolutely. And it would make a huge difference in terms of personnel. Because the Russian army, the peacetime army that they're drawing from at the moment is only 280,000, but they've got more than 1 million people that they can mobilise if they have to, in theory. And so and they are short of people on the ground. It's not undoubtedly true that Russian forces are stretched very thinly, even for what they're trying to do now. So it would make a big difference in terms of bringing new people in. But remember, if you declared mobilisation tomorrow, those forces that are reconscripted or conscripted are not going to turn up for at least 5 or 6 months. They do 2 months basic training, 4 to 5 months specialised training. So you're talking about Christmas time, November, December, before any new troops could appear on the battlefield. And the other thing is that they're not going to get more equipment there. They're bringing out their old stocks of equipment, like with the tank supplies, but they're finding it very difficult to produce new equipment because sanctions have actually stopped the import of components, many of which come from the West. So unless Mr. Putin gets a lot of hardware from China, which at the moment he is not, he can increase his numbers of troops eventually, but even then we'll struggle to actually increase the amount of equipment.
OK, we'll pause it there, Michael. Thanks very much indeed for what we've covered so far. You are watching a question and answer programme about the war in Ukraine. Up next after the break, questions about Germany's contributions to the war effort and Putin's nuclear threats. Welcome back. You're watching Sky News Tonight's question and answer programme about the war in Ukraine with Professor Michael Clarke. In this section, we're going to be answering some of your questions about the international response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the assistance being offered by NATO countries. And earlier today, Sky News spoke to the mayor of Kiev, Vladimir Klitschko, and his brother. They're in Davos in Switzerland for the annual World Economic Forum. The brothers called for a unified international response and warned that the conflict could destabilise all of Europe.
I have a message for every politician right now here in Davos, to everyone in Europe, everyone in the world. If somebody thinks the war is somewhere far away from me, the war doesn't touch me personally is the biggest mistake. This war in the largest country in Europe can destabilize situation in the whole region.
What's the consequences of this war, and the consequences eventually are very scaring. Ukraine is one of the biggest delivers of grain to Africa and Asia, and with the blocking of the Black Sea, obviously we will have hunger in those regions.
Can I show you something? This is, we have a reporter and a team right now in the Donbass. Can I just show you? This is the filming they have done for the last few days.
On the brink of being captured by Russian troops.
The war has horrible face. We saw the consequences in satellite cities as Bucha and Gostomel, just to name a few. The war has horrible face. We've seen all those dead bodies of young women, men, older men being just killed. You could tell they were tortured before, executed with the headshots, with the tight hands behind the back. You could see, you could smell, you could tell the silence of the death and destruction of all the infrastructure and buildings. So war has many horrible faces. And this war was started by Russia. If we don't stop it, if we don't sanction it, if we don't isolate it with one front on gas, oil, coal, athletic team here in Switzerland, the IOC in Lausanne, the IOC headquarters, and it's not just the decision must be made too to isolate from the next upcoming Olympics the Russian team. Nothing is the athletes or nationalities, but to show to Russia this war, and the world is not okay with that. This war crime must be stopped.
Well, there we have the Klitschko brothers there in Davos at the World Economic Forum with, as you could hear there, a warning for the world and a call for more international support. So let's get on with your questions, because we addressed that through Bradley's question, who asks, and he asks a specific question, Michael, why do you think Germany is being very slow in providing heavy equipment to Ukraine? Of course, the mighty economic power that is Germany, its support is crucial, both in terms of those gas supplies, but also in terms of the weaponry. So why is it slow in providing that heavy artillery?
Yes, I mean, Chancellor Scholz, who's SPD, is the left-of-centre party, made some very dramatic statements early on in this crisis, saying that Germany would increase its defence expenditure, would drop its opposition to supplying weapons, would allow other countries who had German components in their weapons to supply, which includes the Dutch and the Danes, for instance. That was quite important. But Germany itself has been really slow in supplying weapons because, to be honest, they're a study in ambiguity. This is agonising for them, because the SPD is identified with being not pro-Russia, but believing that you could deal with Russia, that you could civilise Russia into European society, that you could do trade and you could bring Russia in to the family of nations. But he's now presiding over what's called the traffic light coalition. So his foreign minister is a Green, Annalena Baerbock. Yep, she's one of the Greens, and the Greens are very tough on Russia for moral reasons. And the finance minister is FDP, the Liberals, and they're quite tough on Russia for business reasons, or different business reasons. And so he's presiding over a coalition of three parties that don't normally sit together in government. So it is difficult. However, I have to say, I think that the German public is probably ahead of the government on this, because the German public is so outraged by what they see in Ukraine. I think that they are urging their government to be a bit more proactive. But Scholz, he said all the right things, but he's slow in carrying them through. He's a cautious man.
Are they also in parts held back by their history? I mean, the last time the German forces or German equipment was in Ukraine, we know what happened.
I mean, I sat through I don't know how many meetings years and years ago when everyone would complain in NATO, oh, the Germans won't do this and the Germans won't do that. And I used to say, look, don't complain. This is the Germany we wished for 150 years. This is a civilian Germany who only wants to do things in a civilian way, who does not want to resort to military power. And that is the case. I mean, this Germany at the heart of NATO is very reluctant to go down the military path. And that's because of the effect, not just of the Second World, but the First World War. The 20th century was a disaster for Germany. Germany should have been far and away the most important European power. If you look at the situation of Germany in 1890, they should have dominated Europe, but dominated in all the right ways, the 20th century, instead of which they wrecked themselves in 2 disastrous wars.
Let's follow through on more questions about equipment for Ukraine. And this is revisiting one that has been asked since the beginning of the invasion. Mark asks, how likely is it that the West will give Ukraine fighter jets? As I say, we've been talking about that since February.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is increasingly so. They want MiG-29s, but we've said before that, you know, they're not the be-all and end-all. They may be an air superiority fighter, but they won't help in terms of holding back Russian ground forces. They really need more Su-25s, which are the sort of air-ground bombing aircraft, and they could certainly do with some of those, and they could get them from the West. It's not much point trying to give Ukraine, you know, sort of F-16s, the Falcon or the new version, the Viper or whatever it is, because it would take too long to train the pilots. Not that the pilots couldn't do it, of course they could, but it would just take too long when they're fighting a war for survival. So I think that the short answer is the barriers to giving Ukraine fighter jets are going smaller and smaller. But the thing that makes the most difference to Ukraine's air power is not so much the aircraft as the ground-based anti-aircraft systems, which are remarkably effective against Russian aircraft.
OK, lots more questions to get through. This one from Dan about the UK. Dan says the UK has been supporting Ukraine and has faced very little retaliation. Why is this? Is the fight taking place in the grey zone?
Yeah, it is. No, he's absolutely right. I mean, there is a sort of cyber battle going on as we speak every day. And it's going on, we assume, in both directions. It's not just them attacking us. We assume that we're trying to get in their way and make them trip over their own feet in relation to things in Ukraine. And we're certainly giving Ukraine the best help we can, which has proved pretty effective so far in cyber. So I think that it is going on in the grey zone. But again, it comes back to there's a clear red line in this whole crisis that we've talked about before, which both sides recognise, that NATO and Russian forces will not fight each other directly. And so far, that line is strong and it is held. And for the foreseeable future, I would expect it to continue to hold. And so the Russians also know they can only push us so far, even though they talk as if we are the great Satan and we control everything that happens. And so they pay us the compliment of thinking that we're behind everything.
David asked this, interesting one, this, why are we revealing what is being supplied to Ukraine? Is that not something to be kept secret from the Russians? Well, is everything being revealed?
No. I mean, the things that are clear, I mean, if you're going to supply tanks and artillery pieces and so on, that journalists will report it. We can see it there. There's no reason to try to keep that secret because we want to celebrate the fact that we live in a world with a free press. But I think that there's another issue here, which is that supplying weapons is also a symbol. We're trying to convince the rest of the world and our allies and our friends that we mean it, that we're doing this explicitly. And we want the Russians to know we're doing it explicitly and we'll keep on doing it, which is why the American offer of $40 billion in aid, of which the vast majority will go to military aid, is a really important symbol. And the Americans are saying, look, we've sent 90 M777 howitzers, which are really good 155mm howitzers. We've sent them. Most of them are there. And they're announcing this because they want the Russians to know, they want the Ukrainians to know, they want the Germans to know, and the Italians and the Spanish and everybody else to know that we, the backers of Ukraine, are in this for the long term. So, you know, we're keeping some of it quiet on the intelligence and cyber side, but when it comes to heavy metal, you can't disguise it anyway, so celebrate it.
OK, plenty more questions to come, but a break more immediately. You're watching a question and answer programme about the war in Ukraine. Up next, Putin may have nuclear weapons, and many of them, but does he have the power to launch them? Stay with us.
I'm Inzamam Rashid and I'm Sky's North of England correspondent, telling stories from this culturally rich region I call home.
It's going to become very similar to other places and lose its unique qualities.
It's steeped in history.
If the Taliban found your family, what would happen?
I think they're just going to straight away execute them.
There are issues of racism in all levels of cricket.
I was on the balcony a couple of times. I was nearly gone.
Football is a joy to watch, and when people are disappointed, you can feel the hate.
I just felt physically sick because I was like, that's really in my system.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world. Even before the pandemic, GPs were pleading for help. Government expects more face-to-face contact with patients in return.
Men, they want to force you doing something which you don't want to do, just because you're homeless and you're looking for a warm place to sleep.
We give a voice to communities often unheard and unserved from a region with a distinct history and global impact.
Right then, we've got Michael Clarke here answering your questions, your very good questions about Ukraine. And Mark asks this for our last section. He says, there's talk of President Putin being removed from power. Who might take over, and would they be more friendly to the West? Or perhaps would they at least not have the ego of Vladimir Putin?
I mean, the short answer is we've no idea who might take over, and whoever it is, they probably wouldn't be more friendly to the West, certainly in the immediate term. But however, anyone who is not Putin will think about where they are and, one would hope, be a bit more pragmatic. But, I mean, we all play these parlour games now, is that, you know, who is there around Putin? Because he's surrounded now by so few people that he seems to believe and who are genuinely powerful. The most powerful person to emerge in the last few months is Patrushev, Nikolai Patrushev, who is his National Security Council chief, in effect. He's an old friend. He's more Putin than Putin on Ukrainian issues. He's very, very nationalist, ultra-nationalist and effectively imperialist. And then there's Bortnikov, who is the FSB head of the, the security service, who's an old friend of Putin. They go back a long way. And then there's Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. And Lavrov has, I mean, he used to be a different person a few years ago, but he's really gone to the dark side, as Putin has. And Lavrov, too, has got enormous power, we believe. So you'd look at those three, Patrushev, Bortnikov, Lavrov, as possible successors who might step up in a crisis if Putin died or if he was removed, or maybe one of them would remove him. We're guessing totally. But then you think about Medvedev, who had been president and prime minister, or Matushin, who's the current prime minister. Not really. They don't seem to have that much of a power base. Or Shoigu, the defense minister, he seems very ill, but he's powerful. Putin trusts him. The man who doesn't seem to figure now is Gerasimov, who is the head of the armed forces. He seems to have been wounded a couple of weeks ago in Izium. He wasn't at the May Day rally. He has been seen with Putin since, I think for propaganda purposes, but he hasn't been seen much. So we think that Gerasimov is either more ill than or more wounded than we thought, or he is out of favour. But, when you look around, your fingers of one hand are the people that we think have got power.
But not necessarily going to take a different approach to
absolutely. And it's hard to see
Putin.
Somebody from an outsider stepping in without us seeing them step up before they step in. So it's a very good question. It's one we ask ourselves on a daily basis at the moment.
Keep asking, yeah. Here's a good one from Paul, who, focusing back on Ukraine again. How are the civilian pro-Russian Ukrainians viewing the Russian troops? Of course, many of them been living under effectively Russian rule for 7 or 8 years now.
Yeah, I mean, there's not that many of these people now. I mean, we know that of the 14 million displaced people in Ukraine, 14 million out of 44 million are now out of their homes. And of those 14 million, about 1 million are in Russia. And about 500,000 of that million seem to be there involuntarily. They've just been carted away, and they are, in effect, political prisoners. but about 500,000 seem to have left voluntarily, who we assume are people who would prefer to live in Russia than live in the Ukraine at war. So the number of pro-Russian Ukrainians is probably very small at the moment. That's what we're guessing. Because those who are pro-Russian have had it's been easy for them to just leave. There's lots of ways they could have got out. Ukraine is not a closed society, so they could have just gone over the border in many places and just gone to Russia. I think a bigger issue, not unrelated to this, is people saying, look, I don't care whether I live under Russian or Ukrainian rule, I just want to live. And, you know, a number of correspondents, I think, have been showing up this, that when you get nearer to Severo, Donetsk, a lot of these people say, I just want it to stop. And if it means the Russians winning, well, so be it. I don't care, because I just want to be alive at the end of this. And that's a very understandable human reaction. Not everyone is fiercely Ukrainian. I mean, everyone in Ukraine is a Ukrainian patriot, but some people are more fierce than others about it. And some people who are in the conflict zone just want to still be there in a year's time.
Now, here we get to a question that seems to always come up, and it concerns the entire world, of course. So Lawrence asks this one, and I suppose it's, as we were just discussing, if it's a cornered Putin, a Putin who's losing the war, an ill Putin, a Putin who fears he's going to be removed in a coup, if he orders a nuclear strike, would his defence staff have to obey?
Yes. In theory, if the chief of the state, if the head of state and the chief of the armed forces give an order, then in theory everyone has to obey it. Whether they would or not would depend on the circumstances. And I mean, you know, as we said, the Russians have got about 1,900 tactical nuclear weapons, all with quite a complex command system that goes from the Kremlin right down to the battlefield. Lots of people in the way who might question the order or want clarification or slow it down or want to make sure that they had something written before they took action. If we're talking about strategic nuclear weapons that are fired from submarines, that's direct from Mr. Putin to the submarine captain, so there's not very many people in the way. But it's the case, I have to say, in every country. I mean, if the British Prime Minister issued the order, then yes, the rest of the system would be required to obey the order. Simple as that.
Well, let's end on this note. Unfortunately, another viewer asks, so what system does the UK have to defend itself against a Russian nuclear attack? And given from what you've just said there, Michael,
none at all.
Not a lot.
No, it's not a lot. It's not at all.
OK.
No, to defend itself, the issue is that if you can't defend yourself against an attack, and most missile attacks, whether they're nuclear or conventional, are very hard to defend yourself against. A ballistic missile attack, ballistic missiles which go into space and then come down very, very fast, all you can do is deter. So you can't defend against them with any certainty. There's a bit of missile defence around in the world. The Americans have got a system, but it would only work against 1 or 2 missiles, maybe 6 or 7 at most. Britain doesn't have these things. And so our only response is not defence, but deterrence. So we say, yes, we know we are vulnerable, but we have our continuous at-sea deterrent, CASD, which means that we have 4 nuclear submarines. At any given moment, one of them is out somewhere under the North Atlantic, and within 55 minutes of the Prime Minister giving the order, can fire its missiles against whoever struck us.
So it's nervous times at the moment. Are these hotlines, you know, we all remember from the Cold War, when the generals and indeed the commanders-in-chief, the leaders, were able to talk directly to each other, and if somebody misread someone else's intentions, they were able to calm it all down. Yes. Are they still in operation?
They are, and they're much better. I mean, when we used to talk about the hotlines, they weren't hotlines at all. In Hollywood, it's a telephone that they pick up and talk to. It wasn't like that. It was a teleprinter that took hours to go backwards and forwards. It was astonishing. Crude.
Dr. Strangelove was right.
Absolutely. The more I see Dr. Strangelove, the more, apart from the very end where Slim Pickens goes down on the nuclear weapon, that's the only bit that's surreal. The rest of it, believe me, there is something in our nuclear history where I can tick off, yes, that's happened, that's happened, that's happened, and that's happened. It's a wonderful film, Kubrick's great masterpiece, Dr. Strangelove. It gets less surreal the more you watch it. However, deterrence is about this ability to respond, and yet we have that ability. Whether it's a safe thing to do, who knows? But I have to say, let's not forget that Milley, the American chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was in touch with Gerasimov this week. Yeah. And Lloyd Austin, the defence chief, was in touch with Shoigu this week. So the Americans and the Russians are, at the top level, they're phoning each other and talking to each other in order to keep the temperature as low as they can as military professionals.
Michael, informative as ever, if not more so. Thank you very much indeed, Michael Clarke there. And you've been watching a question and answer programme on Sky News tonight about the war in Ukraine. And coming up on Sky News at 8 o'clock...
Sorry.